The Hoarder's Missing Wife, presented by Absolutely Haunted. My story might disturb you, and if it does, I'm sorry. Some stories need to be told, and this one has been waiting too long in the dark. I found it written in a small, battered diary, balanced precariously on the edge of a table in the heart of a disaster zone, a hoarder's house. The house was a graveyard of forgotten things, layers of dust and decay pressing in from every corner. But it's not the clutter that haunts me. It's what I found in those pages and the ghostly woman who was becoming more violent every day. I recently bought the house, or rather, the disaster held together by dust and desperation. It was, and still is in many ways, a hoarder's dream. Piles of junk, layers of grime, and that unmistakable stale scent of neglect cling to every surface. The original owner's family practically shoved it into my hands for next to nothing. They knew exactly what kind of hellish cleanup it would take, potential structural damage, years of hoarding packed into every room, and they wanted no part of it. That ghostly woman was most likely another reason they sold it as is. The family didn't tell me much about the house's past, just enough to leave me wondering. The man who lived here had been hoarding for decades, burying himself under mountains of clutter. His wife, it seems, had reached her breaking point. She gave him an ultimatum: clean up the mess or lose her forever. He must have chosen the junk, and so she chose the road. She was tired enough to walk away without a backward glance. She vanished sometime in the early 90s, leaving behind a husband and a house sinking under the weight of too much stuff. After she left, it was as if he sealed himself away from the world. He became a shadow, a hermit who only emerged under the cover of night to rummage through the neighbor's trash, searching for what he called treasures. The house itself had once been breathtaking. It was a sprawling mansion that had seen its share of grand parties and glittering nights. They say the place used to pulse with life every weekend, music and laughter spilling out onto the manicured lawns. Now it's a graveyard of memories. The gilded moldings are choked beneath layers of dust, and the once elegant staircase is buried under mountains of garbage. Rotting furniture, broken trinkets, and forgotten relics crowd every inch of space, pressing in like the weight of 1,000 ghosts. The day I found the diary, my wife and I had been talking about the house and her growing suspicion that it was haunted. She'd been trying to make progress upstairs, working her way through the bedrooms, but the hallway was nearly impassable. Old furniture, broken chairs, and stacks of forgotten things clogged the space so completely that you couldn't take more than 2 steps past the top of the staircase without hitting a wall of junk. She said it felt wrong up there, like the air was heavier, pressing down on her as if something didn't want her to reach those rooms. She swore she'd been making good progress, clearing through the debris, finding a rhythm, when she glanced into one of the rooms and nearly lost her mind. It had once been a magnificent bedroom. You could still see the dark paneled walls peeking through the mounds of trash, whispering of past elegance. But something about that room felt wrong. My wife said the vibe of the room changed the moment she stepped closer. It felt colder, heavier. There was a strong depressive feeling in the weighted air. Still, my wife was eager to clean it out, but walking into the room, she froze. In the middle of a towering heap of junk stood a woman. She was wearing modern clothes, but only her neck and head were visible above the trash, as if the garbage was swallowing her. Her hands trembled as she reached toward the debris around her, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto my wife. There was something desperate in that gaze, pleading. Then, slowly, the woman covered her face with her hands and began to sob, deep, heart-wrenching cries that filled the stale air. My wife stood paralyzed as the woman's body began to blur, to fade. And then she was gone. Needless to say, my wife bolted down the stairs and straight out the door. Now she flat out refused to go back upstairs alone. Her face was pale when she told me, her voice sharp and shaking. "Listen to me, Marv. You either come up there with me or you get someone else to help, but I am not going back up there alone. Do you hear me? I'm not doing it." The fear in her eyes was real, raw, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I called up 2 of my nieces and asked if they wanted to make some extra cash helping out their aunt. Both agreed without hesitation and promised to be there early the next morning. Sure enough, at exactly 8 a.m., they were banging on the door of our camper. Marcia and the girls headed back into the house and up the stairs, ready to take on the disaster zone. It was going to cost me some cash, but at least the work would get done faster, and maybe, just maybe, I'd finally get a clear look at the structural damage hiding beneath all that junk. Over the next 3 days, each of them, my wife and both nieces, saw the sobbing woman again. Always standing there, half buried in the junk, those desperate eyes pleading for help. It shook them badly. I had to raise the girls' pay just to keep them from walking out, and even then, they made me promise to come upstairs and work alongside them. Strange things kept happening. One afternoon, we were sweeping out one of the extra upstairs bedrooms, when a massive painting suddenly tore free from the wall. It crashed to the floor, barely missing my head by inches. The sound was deafening, glass and wood splintering across the floor. We all just stood there, frozen, hearts hammering. It didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a warning. We were all standing in the freshly cleaned upstairs hall. We were trying to decide which room to tackle next. I knew none of the women were eager to face that room, not yet. Even though it was the largest and clearing it out would make the biggest difference, they settled on the hall bath instead. Safer, or so we thought. We had barely taken a step toward the bathroom when it happened. Without warning, a deafening crash exploded from the ghost room. Everything, chairs, boxes, shattered glass, even a heavy dresser, came flying out of the doorway, launching down the hall with terrifying force. We dropped to our knees, arms shielding our heads as debris shot past us, slamming into the walls and tumbling violently down the stairs. The air was alive with rage, a cold, suffocating pressure closing in. We didn't speak, we just ran. None of us stopped until we were out of the house, breathless and shaking. And we sure as hell didn't go back in until the next day. You're probably thinking we were crazy to go back after that. Honestly, you'd be right. But all our money was tied up in that house. We couldn't afford to walk away. We'd only been flipping houses for a short time, and we hadn't built up enough capital to let this one sit and rot. Good or bad, ghost or no ghost, we had to clean this place out, make the repairs, and get it on the market. Even if it meant dealing with whatever was still lurking inside. That night, as I sat eating dinner with my wife in the camper, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. There was a pattern, one I couldn't ignore anymore. "What is it?" Marcia asked. I hesitated. "It's the ghost room," I said slowly. "Have you noticed that every time we avoid cleaning it, something violent happens? Like, the ghost is angry. Maybe she hates the clutter as much as we do. Maybe she wants it cleaned up." I braced myself for Marcia to explode, to tell me I was crazy. But she didn't. She just sat down across from me, her expression dark. "You know, Marv, you might be right," she said quietly. "Now that I think about it, that is what happens." She shrugged, but her eyes didn't match the casual gesture. They were wide and troubled. "I guess tomorrow?" We tackled the master bedroom. A cold chill slithered down my spine. Somehow, I knew this wasn't going to end well. The next day, we armed ourselves with trash bags and stepped into the master bedroom, ready to face whatever was waiting for us. And strangely, nothing happened. The air was calmer, almost unnervingly so. No flying objects, no cold spots, no oppressive heaviness pressing down on us. For the first time, it felt like the house was watching, waiting. But there was one thing. Every time someone took a break, stepped out for air or to grab something, they'd hear it. Their name, a soft, breathy voice drifting from somewhere deep within the house. But when they checked, no one had called them. It happened again and again. The voice was patient, persistent. Almost like the ghost was keeping it in line, making sure the work got done. A silent taskmaster, overseeing every sweep of the broom and every scrape of junk being hauled out of that cursed room. It felt less like we were cleaning the house and more like we were following orders. We started near the door, almost as if we were too afraid to face the pile in the center of the room, the spot where the ghost always seemed to appear. Normally, we'd tackle the worst of it head on, tearing through the center without hesitation. But this time, it was different. Without even realizing it, we were sticking to the edges, circling the pile like it was some kind of predator. It wasn't deliberate, it was instinctual. Like some primal part of us knew better than to disturb whatever was lurking beneath that heap of garbage. At one point, everyone had left the room to haul bags to the dumpster. I stayed behind, bent over a pile, scooping up trash with a snow shovel. That's when Carrie walked back in. I heard her gasp, sharp and strangled. I turned my head toward her, and that's when I felt it. A sudden chill raced up my spine, so cold it burned. And then, the sound of crying. Soft at first but growing louder. A raw, broken sobbing that filled the air behind me. Carrie's face drained of color. Her hand shot to her mouth, her eyes wide and brimming with terror. I followed her gaze, slowly, unwillingly, and when I saw what she was seeing, my legs buckled. I stumbled backward into the pile of junk, my breath ripping from my chest. My heart slammed against my ribs, and for a second, it felt like my soul was trying to claw its way out of my body. Because standing there, half buried in the junk, was her. Her eyes were dark with grief, tears streaking down her pale face. And this time, she was looking right at me. There she was, a woman, solid and real, standing knee-deep in the mountain of trash. She wore jeans and a plain button-down shirt, but it wasn't her clothes that froze the blood in my veins. It was her eyes, wide, desperate, boring into us with a silent plea. Slowly, she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the heap of garbage beneath her feet. Her fingers shook as her lips parted. Please? The word came out ragged and drawn, barely more than a breath, but it crawled under my skin like ice water. Her hands flew to her face, covering her eyes as a guttural sob tore from her throat. She shook violently, crying harder and harder until her body began to blur and dissolve. Her form flickered, twisting unnaturally, and then she was gone. The air hung heavy and cold in her absence, leaving behind only the sound of our pounding hearts and the crushing weight of what we had just seen. Carrie's hand shot out while the ghost was still there, grabbing the cuff of my sweater in a white-knuckled grip. Her fingers trembled as she balled the fabric in her fist, her breath ragged and shallow. Neither of us could move. And then, she was gone. Did you see that? Carrie's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide and unblinking. Yes, I said, my voice hollow. I turned toward her, and she looked back at me, her eyes dark with the same chilling understanding that had just dawned in my own mind. We didn't speak further. We didn't have to. Without another word, we grabbed trash bags and turned toward the heap where the ghost had been standing. Our hands moved automatically, tearing through the garbage with frantic purpose. We knew what she wanted. We knew what we had to do. And we weren't stopping until we found it. When Marcia and Jordan came back from the dumpster, we told them everything, every chilling detail. Their faces went pale, but to their credit, they didn't hesitate. Without a word, they grabbed bags and joined us, tearing through the massive pile with renewed urgency. The air in the room felt charged, heavy with expectation, as if something was waiting beneath the debris. And then we found it. At the bottom of the heap lay an overturned wardrobe, massive and ancient. Its dark wood was carved with strange, intricate patterns that seemed almost foreign. I ran a hand over the surface, the wood icy beneath my fingertips. This looks like something pulled straight out of a castle, I muttered, my voice low. How long do you think it's been lying here like this? It took all four of us to lift the thing, it was that heavy. The wardrobe groaned as we forced it upright for the first time in years, the weight of it resisting like it didn't want to stand. Marcia then realized the chest had a broken leg, splintered parts of it still visible on the floor. She grabbed an old, discarded brink in the corner of the room and used it to replace the missing part. My arms were shaking from the effort when I noticed something odd on the front door panels. There was a discolored stain, mottled with green and brown. Mold, maybe? But the texture was strange. Almost like fabric. My hand hovered toward it, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and then the women started screaming. The piercing, blood-curdling sound hit me like a gut punch. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I nearly collapsed. I spun toward them, the blood draining from my face as I saw the terror in their eyes. They were staring at the wardrobe, at something I hadn't seen yet. And then the room went deathly cold. I spun away from the wardrobe, heart still hammering, only to find chaos exploding around me. Jordan bolted straight for the open window, doubling over as she vomited violently. Carrie stumbled into the hallway, clutching her head and screaming, a raw, unhinged sound that tore through the air. My wife, Marcia, dropped to her knees, trembling hands clasped together as she began to pray, "Our Father who art in heaven," her voice choked and desperate. What the hell? And then I saw it. My breath stopped, my chest locked tight as a wave of cold horror crashed over me. My knees nearly gave out as I stared, wide-eyed and shaking, at the thing that had been hidden under the wardrobe. My mind fought to reject what I was seeing, couldn't process it, but there it was. And it was awful. In the center of the once beautiful wood floor was a massive black stain, wide and sprawling, like a dark wound bleeding across the room. It stretched out several feet in all directions, its jagged edges creeping into the cracks between the floorboards. Scattered within the stain were old photographs, faded and curling at the edges. Some were warped and torn, others streaked with dark smears, as if something wet had seeped over them long ago. And then there was something in the middle of the stain. The body lay curled in the center of the stain, a grotesque blend of mummified flesh and brittle bone. Skin, leathery and darkened with age, clung tightly to the skeletal frame. Patches of hair still clung to the cracked scalp, and the hollow eye sockets stared upward in a frozen expression of silent agony. I reached out with a trembling hand, resting it on Marcia's shoulder, halting her frantic prayers. My throat tightened as I forced the words out. "Do you think this is the wife?" Marcia's breath hitched. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she gave a broken shrug, her lips trembling too hard to speak. "I think so." My hands were shaking as I pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I dialed 911, barely able to breathe. The sound of the operator's voice on the other end felt distant, thin. "We found a body," I said, my voice hollow. My eyes stayed locked on that twisted, shriveled form in the center of the stain. "We need help." The police arrived quickly, and the coroner followed close behind. It didn't take long for them to confirm what we already knew. This was an old death. Years, maybe decades. Considering the state of the house, it wasn't exactly shocking that she had gone unnoticed for so long. The detective stood near the doorway, arms crossed as he surveyed the wreckage. He shook his head, the lines on his face deepening. "With the stench of this place, I'm not surprised no one smelled her decaying," he muttered. "This whole property's been rotting for decades." He wasn't wrong. The house itself had been dying, slowly rotting from the inside out, taking its secrets down with it, until now. In the end, they ruled it an accident. They figured the wardrobe had become unstable in the chaos, teetering among the piles of junk until it finally toppled over. The sheer weight of it would have been enough to crush her. A tragic accident born from years of neglect and disorder. But standing in that room, with the ghost's pleading eyes still burned into my memory, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. "Do you think her husband knew?" my wife asked quietly. I hesitated. "I don't know, hun. At the time, I truly didn't. But that was before I found the diary downstairs. I came across it while clearing out what had once been an office. It was buried beneath a mountain of old bills, faded photographs, and brittle papers. Just an unassuming little book, worn leather cover, edges curled with age. But the truth hidden within its pages shook me to my core." The coroner concluded, as best he could, that the wardrobe had indeed been the cause of death. The impact had shattered multiple bones, ribs, collarbone, legs, crushing her beneath its immense weight. It was a brutal, suffocating death, the kind that left no chance for survival. Her body had been trapped there for decades, slowly decaying beneath the crushing weight of wood and time. But that diary told a different story. The husband wrote about his rage, how betrayed he felt when his wife threatened to leave him. The resentment had festered until it curdled into something dark. He decided that if she was going to leave, she wouldn't leave alive. He took an axe with him to her room that night. His plan was simple and brutal. He would end her while she slept. But when he reached the room, she was awake. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by old photographs, their life together scattered around her like broken memories. Tears streaked her face as she rocked gently back and forth. This was the one room she had kept clean, her last sanctuary against the chaos. She had fought to protect it from the rot creeping through the rest of the house. She looked up at him, eyes swollen and red, silent, waiting, and that's when everything went horribly wrong. Why was she crying? She was the one choosing to leave. She was the one tearing them apart. Maybe it was self-pity. Maybe she was finally realizing what she was giving up. She hadn't loved him in a long time. He knew that. He had felt it in the hollow way she spoke to him, in the way her eyes passed over him like he wasn't even there. He stepped into the room, silent as a shadow. Her back was to him, hunched and shaking as she sobbed. He slipped the axe behind his back, fingers tightening around the worn handle. She was so lost in her wailing, so consumed by her pathetic grief, that she never even knew he was there. He raised the axe, heart hammering, breath ragged. And then he swung, but he missed. The blade struck the massive wardrobe, the heavy, ornate chest she had loved and he had bought her for their anniversary, the one he had shipped from Europe for her 10 years ago. The sharp crack of splintering wood filled the room as the axe bit deep into one of the legs. For a split second, everything froze. Then the chest groaned, a low, terrible sound as it began to tip forward. She looked up, eyes wide with shock and horror. Their gazes locked for one agonizing second. She threw up her arm in a desperate attempt to shield herself, but it wasn't enough. The wardrobe came down with brutal force, slamming her onto the floor. The sickening sound of bones snapping beneath the weight made his stomach lurch. Her scream, he wrote, was raw and piercing, cutting through the air, twisting into something ragged and broken. And then, silence. He stepped closer, heart thudding in his ears as he circled the chest. Her body was completely hidden beneath the massive weight of it. Only a limp, pale hand stuck out from beneath the splintered edge, fingers twitching once, then stilling. He stood there for a moment, head tilting slightly as he strained to listen. Nothing. Satisfied, he turned and quietly shut the door behind him. He left her there for years. After locking the door, he simply walked away. But eventually, he needed more space. The house was filling up, the walls pressing in under the weight of his treasures. So he unlocked the door and opened the room. Her remains were still there, twisted beneath the massive chest, but he didn't flinch. He barely even looked at her. Instead, he started stacking things in. Boxes, furniture, clothes, junk, burying her under the ever-growing mountain of clutter. It was better that way. Less chance anyone would ever discover what he had done. Cover your tracks, he knew that. He had learned it young, absorbed it like poison from his parents. You bury the mess, pile it up until it's forgotten, until the weight of it crushes the truth beneath it. And if something occasionally stirred beneath all that weight, if he sometimes heard faint, muffled crying from beyond the door, he convinced himself it was just the house settling. After all, things don't come back once they're buried, right?